Howard got mentioned, but River did.
I texted him this week and asked him if he had surgery, but he got.
He's
I
double
called him
his
last
size.
Sunday, but he hasn't had his vet soon, because they're still trying to check to see if he'll be okay before he has to bed, where they have his schedule.
Yeah.
He said he was hoping to be here today, as soon as he's on time.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
I feel like we need to start over, y'all.
No, we just doubled it.
Hey. Howdy. Got the high school graduate here.
Great, okay, glad you're all here. We're gonna start where we left off, which was into Romans 3 into Romans 4. So up to this point, you know, we've gotten through Romans 1, in which Paul indicts humankind for impiety and unrighteousness, and says that on that basis, God is wrathful, but also because he's being faithful to his promises also include promises to save. And so now he's expressing his faithfulness to his promises to save his people. And then he describes that. And he expands again on a bit of the sin problem that everybody has. He says in Romans 3 that, look, beginning of 3, that Jews have an advantage, but it's not an advantage that guarantees protection from judgment. Because just having the advantage, i.e. the advantage of circumcision, the advantage of having known God's law and all that sort of stuff, it's actually only beneficial if you keep the law, what he says in the 2. So, like, he says, circumcision is only beneficial if you're a lawkeeper. But if you're not a lawkeeper, then circumcision doesn't actually benefit you anything. Your circumcision might as well be foreskin. That's what he said in chapter 2. And then he mentions, so he kind of opens that question back up again. What then, in 3:1, what then is the advantage of the Jew, and what is the advantage of circumcision? He says, great in every respect, for they receive the oracles of God. But then he talks about the fact that, okay, but they weren't faithful to the oracles they received. So they didn't keep the law, and they didn't also see, as they ought to have, in Paul's mind, that the law testified about the Messiah. And so then he says, oh, okay, they indeed had an advantage, but that advantage, Philippians 3, 8, and 9, says, does that mean that they're better off? Are we better off? And he says, well, no, I've already indicted that both Jews and Greeks are under sin. And then he quotes a Philippians scripture from 3, 10 to 18. The scriptures come from the Psalms and Isaiah, proving the fact that, okay, look, scripture itself proves that everyone's committed all these kinds of sins. And importantly, as we've said a few times now, the category of sins for which he indicts the people include idol stuff, possession of idols or idolatry or whatever else, sexual immorality and murder, and bloodshed. This is the way it puts it in chapter 3. Their feet were quick to shed blood. And again, the reason that's significant is because there are 3 categories of sin for which there's no sacrificial expiation. In other words, it's not like Israel could be guilty of these things, but then just go make up for it through giving a bunch of sacrifices. No, in order to get out of that problem, they need something else. They just endure God's punitive discipline, which then Paul says that Christ did on their behalf. Endure the punitive discipline occasioned by the commission of those sins. And then now, the benefit of that can be given to all those who believe. So now we're going to pick up in 3. 27. It says, where then is boasting? It's shut out. But it's shut out through what kind of law? Through the law of works? No, rather through the law of faith. And this is where 3:28 sets the tone for the rest of all the way through chapter 4. And this is a passage that reveals a lot about Paul's thinking about the law. This is where we reckon that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of the nations? Yes, of the nations also. Because God is one, he will justified in circumcision, Jews, from faith, and the foreskin, that in reference to Gentiles, through faith. So again, notice the logic. A person is justified by faith apart from works of law, or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of nations? Yes, the God of the nations also, since God is one. Because God is one, he'll justify both groups on the same grounds. Notice the logic. The reason in this particular passage that justification is by faith and not by works of the law is not because the law is about earning. Paul does think you can't earn your salvation. That's obviously true. Paul doesn't think you can earn your salvation. I'm taking that for granted. My point is that's not the basis of his claim that justification is not by the law yet. Or else the subsequent question about the ethnicity of the recipients would be a non sequitur. He says, justification, a person is justified by faith, not by works of the law, or is God the God of the Jews only? In other words, his logic is, if God were the God of the Jews only, justification could be through works of the law. The reason being because the law was given to the Jews. But because God is not the God of the Jews only, because he's also the God of the nations, that must mean, it requires, that justification cannot be through works of the law. Or else that would imply that all those other nations have to become Jews through works of the law in order to become parts of God's people. All right, pause there. Questions through there? Y'all understand that logic?
Mine was not so clear as your reading. Mine, verse 36, indeed God who will justify the circumcised by faith and uncircumcised by faith.
Yeah. It just reverses the which one begins the clause and which one ends it. But in either case, the claim is, because God is one, he will do this. You either say, he'll do it this way because he is one, or he's one, therefore he'll do it this way. And I think the syntax, the way it's organized in Paul's composition justifies the translation. Because God is one, he'll do this.
I wouldn't have seen that when it's read it. What you read. Since that was one first.
Yeah, which is how Paul begins the clause. Yeah. So importantly, what you have to recognize in this this way of putting it is that the law. I'm just going to write an arrow. The arrow is going to signify a lot of things. The law governs Israel, or the Jews, in an exclusive way. This is a basic conviction from both actually the Bible, but also in the way that Jews read it. The law was not given to everybody. It was only given to the seed of Jacob, Israel. And as such, it governs their life particularly. So the law is not a universal, timeless norm. That's implicit in the law itself, right? It even says this with respect to things we've talked about this a lot. Sorry, that was field. Some of you, but this was it says this like with respect to the food law, right? Everyone like famously knows that one of Israel's idiosyncratic laws is the fact that they have unique dietary systems. Israel did not and does not believe that the other nations are obligated to those dietary laws. They recognize that this is a dietary system given to us, and it is obligatory for us because we're the people to whom this law was given. It's not obligatory to non-Israelites. So a Gentile eating pork is not sinful. This is implicit in Leviticus 11 itself, where it says, Moses and Aaron, speak to the Israelites and tell them, these animals are unclean for you. It emphasizes over and over again. Tell the Israelites that this is obligatory or unclean for you. That for you is sort of italicized cannot eat it. So there you've got an animal that's prohibited for Israel. Right? And the rest of the verse says, you want to know? We talked about it a lot. It's also a slugs and mud song as well. So that. Slugs and Bugs is a kids' music parts. They sing silly songs for kids, and they made a whole song out of Deuteronomy 14:21. The verse is, you may not eat anything that you find already dead, but you may give it to the foreigner who lives in your midst, and he may eat. So it's like you just pass over. You never think this is a significant verse, right? Except there, look, an animal that's forbidden for Israel is, in the same verse, permitted for non-Israelites. Even non-Israelites who live in the territory of Israel. So you can be a non-Israelite who lives in Israel and still not be obligated to what the law obligates of Israel. Right. I saw two hands.
So since Paul's kind of the way I understand it, since Paul's kind of telling them, if you're not circumcised, but you're still following the law, you're doing what the law says, then it's like you're circumcised.
Mm-hmm. It says it will be reckoned as circumcision.
So
It doesn't say it's like you're circumcised now. Well, that's the significance, because he doesn't give them the title of circumcision at the present. He says it will be reckoned to you in a judicial way, because it's a positive term.
that came up there then, or over here.
Huh?
That same like in heaven, in judgment.
Not in heaven, but yeah, in judgment. Yeah, in judgment, it will be reckoned as if you had been a circumcised life.
But so since I'm a Gentile,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm following the law, but I don't have to eat. I can eat all the shrimp I want.
Correct. Yeah. Precisely. Yeah. It's precisely the logic implicit in Acts 15, and in Paul. I think he thinks Acts 15, and I think Paul does think actually that humans are obligated to keep the law. It's just that the law doesn't obligate Gentiles very much.
Got that one?
Yeah, I mean, it obligates them to no idolatry, no sexual morality, and no bloodshed. Which are the things you see Paul emphasizing in every single one of his texts, right? Outside of the bloodshed doesn't come up a ton, because not a ton of murder in his audience, but the other two come up like every other letter. Flee idolatry. I mean, the same passage in 1 Corinthians 10, he just joins them. He says, flee sexual immorality and flee idolatry. Same passage, right? They're just united for that. Bloodshed, just assume everyone knows. The reason that I'm emphasizing this, you're like, why are we talking about this? Here's why. Because look at the logic. Because the law is given to Israel, if justification required you kept the law, it would imply that you thereby had to kind of become someone who was obligated to the law, i.e. you'd have to become an Israelite. But if you had to become an Israelite in order to become part of God's people, what would that imply about God?
Only like Israelites.
That he's only the God of the Jews. Hence Paul's logic. Justification, we reckon that a person is justified by faith apart from works of law, or is God the God of the Jews only? That is a non sequitur, unless his point is that the nations are also part of God's people without having adopted the Mosaic law. With me? So the reason this is relevant is because it means that his criticism is not of law keeping generally. Like he's not against people like obeying the law. He thinks that's good in and of itself. His criticism is people thinking that they need to become Jews in order to become part of God's people, because that compromises the oneness of God. God is one, and therefore he's the God of all nations. If he's the God of all nations, then the nations get to stay nations. Right?
So the uncircumcision are
Yes.
through faith, and the
Say
others
again.
are by faith.
Oh yeah. Let's see.
Okay, it was just in my brain.
Yeah, it is interesting. They are different in it's very, I'm glad you noticed it. People have noticed that for a long time, because it's, Paul uses different prepositions for some reason, and people have a lot of different theories about it as to what it is. So in 30, verse 30 says, if God is one, since God is one, he'll justify the circumcision, ek pisteos, from faith, and he'll justify the word is foreskin, which is an autonomy for the Gentiles. He'll justify the foreskin dia pisteos, through faith. He changes his prepositions. I don't know why. I mean, 5 different theories, right? One is that the ek, the from, implies that the Jews already have a natural proximity. And so this is, and the ek language, from language, is often related to genealogical language. And so because it's about the genealogy that already has a natural proximity to God, that's why they're, I'm not sure. It's possible, but it seems to make a lot of difference on the distinction of those prepositions that admit lots of different interpretations, that yield lots of different interpretations, that no single one has like an obvious superiority to the other. So I'm sure someone is right about it. I just don't know who it is or what Paul's point
Now,
precisely is.
it
in
just
changing
shows
verses.
again a difference between the Jew and the Gentile.
Yeah, and that's at the very least, that's what some people have noted. They're like, he changed the preposition because he wants to distinguish these parties, despite uniting them, right? That's actually the point.
Is this a New Testament versus Old Testament thing? Because weren't there times in the Old Testament where people had to be circumcised? When they comforted them, or they,
Only, so it's not an old versus new thing. It's a question of,
well, before Jesus, after Jesus?
yeah, it's more a question of, I think it's probably best to put it. In the Torah, God took Israel for himself, despite being the God of all nations. He took Israel for himself and then subjugated the other nations to other powers. It seems to have been a discipline that he subjugated those other nations to other powers. And that now he's reclaiming them. He's reclaiming the nations. And that because he's now, at this moment, reclaiming the nations, the question is, do they stay nations or do they become Israel? And for Paul, lots of things are at stake. The oneness of God. Because God is one, he's the God of all nations, and therefore the nations ought not have to become Israel to become part of God's people, right? That's one factor. The other factor is God's promises to Abraham, which actually leads us to Romans 4. Promises to Abraham were, in you, Abraham, I'll bless all the families of the earth, and I'll make you a father of many nations, and in you all the nations will be blessed. All things that God's promise to Abraham cannot be kept if the nations Judaize, if the nations become Israel. So if the nations adopt law observance and thereby become Israel, God literally cannot keep his promise to Abraham. Right? Y'all follow the logic, right? Because here's the thing. I think you're stuck with the page. Don't rip like it's not fast. Here's the logic, right? A Gentile is a non-Jew, right? But as soon as a Gentile who goes to law observance, what happens to them? All he has this word for it. They Judaize. This is why it's not a pedantic point. In Galatians, you'll often see people say like, oh, well, those were the people who were trying to compel the Gentiles to get circumcised. Those are the Judaizers. Y'all heard that before? The Judaizers are the people, right? It's actually not true. They're the people who are compelling the Galatians to get circumcised are not the Judaizers. They're the agitators. The Judaizers are the Gentiles who are being compelled to get circumcised. Because if these Gentiles get circumcised, they thereby Judaize, i.e. become Jews. And this is what we have to recognize. Then, as now, ethnicity was a malleable construct. It was certainly tied to genealogy and land adherence, but it was also recognized that you could forge connections in certain ways. And that they recognized that a person could nationize toward another nation by adopting that nation's customs. So we use the same language, right? If someone who's born in another nation comes here, and they've adopted all of our customs, they've become a citizen, we say they've Americanized, right? Or whatever, once they've adopted their, assimilation is now our word for it, but we even still have the word, where we put the nation followed by the suffix "ize." You Americanize. So if a Roman person wanted to become a Greek, they would adopt Greek customs, and thereby they would Hellenize. If a Roman wanted to become a Greek, they would adopt Greek customs and Hellenize. The other way around. A Greek wants to become a Roman, they would adopt Roman customs and Romanize. If a Roman wants to become a Jew, he would adopt Jewish customs and thereby Judaize. Paul is saying, look, if Gentiles keep the law, they Judaize, i.e. become Jews. And then God can't be the God of all nations. Therefore, he's not just saying Gentiles ought not, he's saying Gentiles do not. Like he's telling them, do not do it, because you would then thereby Judaize, and then you would compromise God's promise to Abraham. He told Abraham, look, you're going to be father of many nations. That promise cannot obtain if all the nations cease to exist, because they all Judaize. So now let's go to Romans 4, okay? Enough of that. Or sorry, not enough of that, but it's actually what leads us into Romans 4. So then he says, right, okay, look, if justification is not by works of the law, but is through faith, etc., wouldn't that nullify the law? That's what he then asks in 3:31. Look at 31. Do we thereby nullify the law through faith? The question is, like, he's about to ask because he realizes, like, you could, an interlocutor could bring up the issue of Abraham. Like, well, hold on. Didn't Abraham get justified because he got circumcised? Like, didn't Abraham receive circumcision, and that's when it was reckoned to him as justification, and all that sort of stuff? And so he's a sort of a fictive interlocutor could ask the question, hold on. If justification is by faith and apart from works of the law, and therefore you're telling the Gentiles they don't need to get circumcised, what about Abraham? Abraham got circumcised. It's like the first thing God did with him, right? And Paul says, well, actually, it wasn't the first thing. There was something important that happened before that. So this is what he means by setting up the issue in chapter 4 with the question in 3:31. Do we thereby nullify the law through faith? Absolutely not. Rather, we establish the law. In other words, we establish what the law actually teaches on this matter. And he goes to the interlocutor and then asks the fictive interlocutor. Fictive interlocutor is often used to just advance the conversation. They'll ask a rhetorical question that will then set up the next thing Paul wants. So I mean, it's all Paul, but it's just him voicing a potential question so that then he can answer it. So then after he just said that justification is by faith and not through works of the law, the question is, well, what about Abraham? And that's how you should look at 4:1. What then shall we say that we have found about Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh? Know that translation is probably different than what you say, what you have. 4:1 is notoriously difficult. That's how I think you should translate it. What then shall we say that we have found about Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh? If you want to know why I translated it that way, I've written on it, I can give you that. But it's a kind of technical Greek argument that I just take it for granted for the moment. Unless you want to ask about it if you want those. Okay, I think you should translate 4:1 that way. What then shall we say that we have found about Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh? For if Abraham had been justified by works, he would have a boast, but not before God. But what does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. But to the one who works, his reward is not reckoned according to a gift, but rather to what is owed to him. But to the one who doesn't work, but believes on the one who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned to him as righteousness. Just as David says concerning the blessing of human, to whom God has reckoned righteousness apart from works. And then he quotes this psalm. Blessed are those whose sins are forgiven, and whose acts of lawlessness are forgiven, and whose sins are not accounted to them. For blessed is the man over whom sin. Noticeably, this comes from a psalm where David is thanking God for having forgiven him apart from any sacrifices that he offered. Because in that psalm, recall, what kind of transgressions did David commit? Murder and sexual immorality, for which there was no sacrifice. And so he says, God, just have mercy on me, please. And God does. And he's like, well, how awesome is that? In other words, but again, there's a reason for it. Paul has just indicted humans for the very sins that David committed. And both are now receiving forgiveness apart from works of the law that they did. Because remember, works of the law would include at least sacrifices. Sacrifices are a work that the law prescribes. And David says that, and that's all. What work could I have done? I.e., what sacrifice could I have brought? That would have gotten me out of this mess. And his answer is nothing. If you wanted to sacrifice, I would bring it. But you don't. Rather, what you want is a try hard, perfect spirit, etc. And so it's within that context of recognizing that there's no sacrifice that he can bring to get him out of the mess. And the mess that he's created is one, particularly the two of the three cardinal sins, right? Cardinal sins. Whereas Paul has likely, also similarly, just indicted his community of these sins and says, you got out of it not because of anything you did, right? Or you got out of it. You received God's grace and forgiveness, apart from anything that you've done.
So that's what it means when it says will not take into account.
Yeah,
That's a sin.
it's not reckoned to him. Yeah. Any questions through there? Now it's going to get cooking with the Abraham stuff again, okay? You got to hold on to your hat. This blessing, therefore, so now you notice the blessing that he's referred to is the blessing of forgiveness given to a person apart from any works of the law that they did, right? And then he shifts and asks a question. And this question, again, this question just wouldn't make sense unless Paul were tracking still with the same argument that he ended chapter 3. Namely, this blessing that God gives. What was Abraham like when he got that blessing? That's the question you're about to ask and answer. This blessing, therefore, is it given upon those, Paul just says, upon the circumcision? Or is it given upon the foreskin? Circumcision and foreskin are here autonomies for Jews and Gentiles. Or for the state of yourself, relative to circumcision. For we say, it was reckoned, his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. How then was it reckoned? In other words, when did this reckoning of justification or righteousness come to Abraham? Was it while he was in circumcision? Or was it while he was in a state of foreskin? And he says, it was not in circumcision, but it was in foreskin. In other words, it was while Abraham was still foreskin that he received this blessing from God. After that, after having received this blessing from God while in the state of foreskin, he then received the sign of circumcision, which was a seal of the righteousness of the faith that he had while he was in his foreskin state. In other words, he's bringing up Abraham precisely because he knows he could falsify his argument. His argument is, the person is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Right? And one word, obviously, would be circumcision. So someone could bring up the case of Abraham and could say, whoa, like, Abraham is circumcised, and he seems to be a pretty important figure, like he's the father of our people, right? So shouldn't that come into account? And Paul's saying, okay, let's think about that. Let's go back and read these texts. God blessed Abraham and reckoned righteousness because Abraham had faith. When was the first time Abraham had faith, remind me? Yeah, and Paul's point is, did he have his foreskin then? Or was he circumcised? And he's like, he had his foreskin.
So if Abraham was circumcised after his faith,
Yeah.
that might have been mainly his desire to follow the law as a grateful heart
Yeah.
for being receiving grace in his faith.
I think that's right. It's an aspect to follow the law.
Because you want to follow
I think that's exactly right. That's certainly one piece of Paul's argument is that look, he was reckoned righteous by faith, etc. before any law was. Right?
The willing spirit.
There was a willing spirit. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. He also then capitalizes on another point, which is that he was reckoned righteous while he had his foreskin, and then he received circumcision. And Paul then assigns two equal but distinct values to that. He says he was reckoned righteous while he had a foreskin, so that he could become the forefather of those who are foreskinned and yet have faith. Just like Abraham. Like Abraham, first time Abraham had faith was while he had foreskin. And so he's saying, look, that was to show to typify and to make Abraham the father of those who are foreskinned and have faith, so Gentiles. He says, but then he also received circumcision. And Paul actually assigns a purpose to it. Look for 12, 13, 11. He received the sign of circumcision, the seal of the righteousness of the faith that he had while in his foreskin. And look, he gives a purpose for it. Why? Why did he receive circumcision? So that he could be the father of all who believe while possessing foreskin. In verse 12. And so that he could be the father of the circumcision. I.e., to those who are not just circumcised only, but also are circumcised and walk according to the footsteps of faith that Abraham had while he was in his foreskin. In other words, he assigns a value, a purpose rather, to Abraham having been foreskinned when reckoned righteous, and to his subsequently having gotten circumcised. He says the value of that is so that he can be the father of all those who believe while being foreskinned. And then he got circumcision so that he could be the father of all those who are circumcised and have faith. In other words, so that he can be the father of Gentiles and Jews. You're with me? Yes?
So, God is one and the Father of all nations.
Yeah?
Why does he then single out Israelites?
He does single them out as, yeah, Deuteronomy just said, just because I wanted to, I left you guys, I wanted you all as my own cherished possession. To have Deuteronomy 32 and 3 put it, selected you guys as special possession for myself. But then notice that this is kind of Paul's whole point. That's not at odds with him also then reclaiming the nations. It's Paul's precise point. God can have a cherished nation in Israel and also still be the God of all nations and include them all, and bestow the same gifts on them all, actually, with the exception of one gift. One gift he does not give to the nations that he does to Israel.
Sickness through Israel.
The law! The law is the gift that he gave Israel that he didn't give to non-human nations. Some of the commandments from the law, obviously. Right? I mean, a lot of what we call, like basically we call it morals, right? But like, they didn't call it morals, but just what we think of as human morals. But a lot of what we now call like idiosyncratic or distinctive elements, stuff that Israel did that others didn't do, like circumcision, food laws, certain aspects of ritual purity, certain agricultural laws, they just weren't given to the nations, right? So he gives all the same gifts to them, except this one. But that's fine. That's just a way to distinguish Israel. That's even how he says it here. Look, he gave Abraham circumcision. He justified him while he had foreskin, and then gave him, actually talks about it as if he was giving a gift. He says Abraham received it. He says, then he gave him circumcision. And that was so that he could be the father of both groups. Right? He could be the father of foreskin believers, referring to Gentiles, and the father of circumcised believers, referring to Israel. Which is what he then goes on to say. Look at verse 13. Because this is the logic. This is the direction his logic goes. For it was not through the law that the promise was made to Abraham or to his seed, that namely that he would inherit the world, but it was through the righteousness of faith. For, here's why the promise of inheritance is not through the law. If it were, faith would be empty. If the inheritors were economical, if the inheritors were only of the law group, then faith would be empty, and the promise would be nullified. What promise? That he would be the father of many nations. That's what Paul then goes on to say. Look at verse 16. Therefore, it's on the basis of faith, so that it can be in keeping with the gift, so as to make secure the promise to all the descendants. Not just to the descendants who are of the law only, but also to the descendants who are just following the footsteps of Abraham's faith, like the Gentiles. Those who follow in the footsteps, who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all, just as it is written, I will make you a father of many nations. In other words, the promise to Abraham is, I'll make you a father of many nations. And Paul says that is why, one of the reasons why the inheritance of belonging to God's people and inheriting the world, etc., is not through the law. Because if it were, it would mean that the vast majority of the recipients of God's promise couldn't actually receive it. You're with me? You're following that? If the inheritance were only given to the of the law people, well then that would nullify God's promise, because God's promise says Abraham will be father of many nations.
At the time that Abraham went, he was going to sacrifice Isaac.
Yeah.
At that time, was there the nation of Israel, or Abraham was the first?
Correct. No, there's not. Abraham's the beginning.
Right.
And then he's promised seed, and he gets some. He gets, Ishmael. But God, it's another actually good example of the way in which God's promise is particular. He didn't just say, Abraham, I'll give it to your son. He said, Abraham, I'll give it to your son that you have with Sarah. So then that's why Isaac is the seed.
Right. So at this time, there were people all over that we don't read about them. There were other people around.
Yeah, other nations.
So was God perhaps looking for that person of faith who would follow him and do? And that's why he favors Israel?
Possibly. It's interesting. Biblical text, the Genesis itself doesn't say as much. And subsequent readers actually took it in very different directions. Some readers took it in the direction of, oh, no, Abraham was just as godless as anyone else. And in order to show that God just acts this way because he's merciful, he chose someone as godless as anybody else, Abraham. Some people took it the other direction and said precisely like, oh, well, Abraham was a super virtuous guy. He wasn't an idolater. He wasn't all these other things. And that's why God chose Abraham. Paul seems to, I think, go that direction. In fact, he even says, look, he justified Abraham as an example to show us that God justifies the ungodly. That example doesn't work unless Paul thinks that Abraham in his past was ungodly, which is actually the way that some Jew interpreters did take Abraham's story, that he lived in a land of idols, and that his dad was an idol maker, and that God said, hey, leave your father's house and go to somewhere else, precisely because I want you to get away from idols. That's how this text goes. Now, all this is to say is that, then we'll be done. All this is to say is that Paul's reasoning about the law has a pretty it seems obvious to me, pretty obvious like ethnic component to it. And that one of the reasons why you ought not, that he's so militant against Gentile adoption of circumcision and other things like that is not because he's anti-law, but because Gentiles keeping Torah in the way the Jews do would Judaize them and would thereby compromise the oneness of God and falsify his promises to Abraham. He cannot keep his promises to Abraham, to bless the nations, etc., if all the nations Judaize. Which then opens up the door for having, as you helpfully mentioned, Paul can very positively talk about people being obedient to God because of what God has done for them, the act of grace, He's given to His people, and the Spirit is given to them. And there's no sort of inconsistency there. It's because He's talking about two different things.
It's not following the law out of a response to your sin. It's out of following the law based on your thankfulness.
Yeah.
And it's a good law. Who wants to get something dead on the road?
Exactly. That's right. That's consensus element. Yeah. That's right. It's a good spot. Thank you for that. I'll pray and we can go upstairs. Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you for this time together. Thanks for your many gifts. Thanks for your generosity, giving your Son and giving your Spirit, and giving us the Scriptures that teach us about them and about all your mighty acts. We love you, Lord. We trust you. We lift up those prayers mentioned earlier, including Howard and his well-being in his body. We pray this upcoming time of worship is glorifying to you.